The next step here, we have applied all our maps, and we just now want to create a basic turntable for this to see here how this one looks, and that's going to be the next step. Let's say that we want to add a ground here just to see how it will react with indirect bounces here, this asset as well. I'm just going to insert a grid. So a tab and type grid. I'm just going to add it here underneath here and see what scale we have for this grid. Yeah, so there you go. Now you can see here how this asset will react to, for example, indirect here. Let's create a camera next here. So I'm going to hit tab and say camera. This is going to be our render camera. We can name it render cam as well. It's living here under this path here. In our case, this is fine. Cameras, render cam. And now here to actually use this camera, we're gonna go here to my no cam here, drop down and say camera, render cam. And we can see we're essentially inside the object because this one is created in center of the world and our geometry is also standing there. We're gonna hit this lock here and essentially lock this camera. So now if I start to navigate here, tumble around, we're gonna see here that essentially we get our camera following our navigation. If you would unlock this one, as soon as I now start to move my camera, we're gonna get essentially drop out from the camera and leave the camera behind. So if you wanna go back to your camera, take your camera drop down here and select it again, lock it, and now when you move your scene, you're essentially moving the camera and you're looking through the camera. So we wanna now place this essentially. I'm just gonna select something here, my base. I'm gonna control F on the base. I'm zooming in. I'm gonna swivel around here and say, take my initial frame here that we wanna do turntable render against, and we can now unlock it here. Let's insert a transform next. So a transform is essentially a way to rotate or manipulate positions in space. And you select here essentially what you want to rotate or scale or transform. And in our case, we just want to say take this snail group here and say insert it into our primitive here. If I go and hit the blue button here, so we're essentially looking through this point in time and start to middle. If I hit middle mouse and go to my rotate, this one, and just start to shift it, you see here I'm also now rotating the entire object here, and you can increment this one. So if I disable this node, it's gonna now jump back into the original position. If I enable it, it's gonna override whatever is within this path here. With this in mind, we can actually animate this rotate parameter and get this one to spin onto its own axis. And that's kind of a super basic turntable. And we can obviously make this even more fancy with like backgrounds or a plinth or anything. In our case, I just want to rotate the object on its own axis, looking through the camera just to see here essentially what happens. Let's set up an animation to this next. Depending on how many frames you want to rotate this one on, it's up to you, but maybe like 25 or something frames is enough for you to be able to see here what's going on with your asset. Let's set this to one to essentially 50 frames. I'm doing this on the timeline here, so I have 50 frames. So I'm gonna rotate the object 25 frames and then rotate my light 25 frames. Gonna name this one rotate asset. Okay, so now we wanna set up the rotation animation here. I'm gonna add my keyframe here on this initial frame, go to frame 25 and say 360 here, and set a keyframe, commit change or alt and left button like so. It will start to rotate here now. There you go. And from frame 25 to 50, we want to rotate the light. So we can do that as well. We can do that by inserting another transform. And this one is going to be rotate light. And here we want to take my primitive of my light here and say, I want to take the doom light, and let's set the keyframe here on frame 25, that keyframe, and go to frame 50 and say 360 degrees and commit change like so. And obviously we need to be onto the transform node for this to come through here. First 25 frames, the object will spin onto its own axis like so, and after those 25 frames we will have 25 frames where the HDR will spin around its own axis, and that's essentially a very, very, very simple turntable. We can make a more advanced tutorial where we will put this together with the plinth and a cycloramic background, but just to see here your basic textures, this might be enough for you to judge what you're doing. If you want to have more specular roughness or less, or if you want to change something, you can essentially render this turntable and see here what happens. So the next step would be to insert essentially some render nodes here to be able to render this out to disk. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at how we can set up the render nodes so we can render the actual turntable. If you want to support my channel, consider dropping a comment in one of the videos with information of upcoming episodes you want to see from Meshmen Studio. See you on the channel. Bye bye.